substance abuse analysis. That's awesome. Because I also want to look at different races.
How are you?
Good. Thank you.
And then they started bringing
Thank you for inviting us.
It's just that I don't know, I have so little time and I want to do things on weekends.
You're headed back to after this.
I'll come back in June.
Also, there's a lot later than chatting and
Try to come back mid-August and August.
Jersey.
And if it works, really, the elections in the summer. I'll, for you, I have a couple of other projects that are less related to genetics, so I'm always busy.
So you'll let me know.
I will definitely. And I had a meeting with the professor from Hawaii. He said he has my figures out. He has less spending than he thought he would, but he still has some. So if I want to do like antlers and stuff, or other low small sample, small sample study, but with better sampling, say, then I can do that too.
And they don't know. So just leave it up in the air for a year, just like that, and it's
Yeah, it's not much, but that's. He says maybe it's not be worth to have it like BYU with a second post in university. That's just to go through the paperwork.
So it's
It's he's at political science, and he's doing guys are saying they're interested in what I do. Among others.
Okay, so we're ready to get started here. Welcome, if you haven't been here before, and maybe even if you have, to our monthly series of talks on ethical, legal, and social implications of genetics. Let me give you some coming attractions, because next month is the last of the season's talks, and then we'll start up again. We'll take a break for the summer. We'll start up again in September. On June 10th, just over a month from today, I'm excited because Eric Turkheimer is coming from the University of Virginia. Eric is one of the leading behavioral geneticists in the world, former president of the Society of Behavioral Genetics, and a very interesting guy who is able to take a step back from the work in his field and really evaluate it from a skeptical perspective when it's necessary to do that. So I think that will be a fascinating talk. That's Wednesday, June 10th, right here from 4
that's in direct conflict with the dean's talk. 4 o'clock that afternoon, the dean is going to talk about.
So I know that, but I scheduled this before the dean scheduled his.
But he figured you are.
And, we've got plane tickets booked and hotel room booked and a speaker committed, and we will just have to live with Arnott at his talk, although I regret missing. Today, however, I'm delighted to introduce to you one of our fellows for the year, Alexandre Morin Chasse. Alexandre comes to us from Montreal, where he completed his PhD in political science and communications, and is here as a postdoctoral research fellow sponsored by the Scientific Fund of the province of Quebec. He has been working with us this year on a continuation of his research on how lay people interpret news about behavioral genetics, which I think has implications, although he might not say it because he wants to be appropriately cautious. I think it has implications for work that goes well beyond behavioral genetics and applies to the understanding of genetics by the general population as a whole. Although we teased you all with the title for this talk, scientists really haven't found the gene for infidelity. But other than that, everything that you read is completely accurate. So, Alexandre.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Thanks to the Center for inviting me to do this talk. Just to begin, I'd like to tell you what inspired this funny title. What inspired this title is a news article that was published on the website of a British newspaper a couple of weeks ago. So the newspaper is the Daily Mail, and the title was a little bit longer. It says, "Women are more likely to cheat on their partner if they carry the infidelity gene, scientists discover." And if we go quickly through the fact points that was accompanying the article, it says, scientists have found variations of a gene are linked to extra-pair mating. Variants of infidelity gene make women more likely to cheat on partners. University of Queensland scientists studied DNA in lives of 7,378 people. They found variant of gene present in large number of unfaithful women, and variant AVPR1A gene only has an impact on women. Scientists find. The funny thing that goes with this story, maybe it's a little bit small, but this news article was published on the day after Valentine's Day. So maybe there was some editorial decision behind this. You can imagine a woman who cheats on his boyfriend on Valentine's Day and then tries to find an excuse on the day after, opens the newspaper, and then I suppose I have this gene. But that's not the point of my talk. It's just a bit funny. However, it's not the only place where this kind of finding about infidelity gene appears in the news. That was a little bit. That was in the end of November. This was a news article published in the Telegraph, suggesting that cheating on your other half can be inherited. And here we have a picture of what cheating means in the United Kingdom. It's actually texting someone else when you're in bed. But I don't think that was the measure they were using. But there's also another coverage in an Australian newspaper next to it. Thing is, there's also this kind of coverage in American media, as you know, I'm sure, and also in more formal science communication magazines. Though these news articles here, they date a little bit more. The one from American Scientist was in 2000, and the other one from New Scientist was in 2008, I think. Yes. So, okay. As Professor Applebaum said in the first place, I did a PhD in political science. So what brought me from political science to behavioral genetics and science communication? Well, the thing is that in the discipline of political science, there is a new field called geopolitics. And the first news article in this field was published in 2005 in the top journal in political science, American Political Science Review. It was a twin study suggesting that whether you're left-wing or right-wing, conservative or liberal, is influenced by people's genetic background, and there was an heritability estimate of approximately 40 to 45% here. So this goes, and it is published in the top journal in political science. And shortly after, in 2008, there is this first candidate gene analysis published also in another top journal in political science. And this time we have another catchy title, even better than mine. 2 genes predict voter turnout, though we might rather say partly predict or account for a small share of the variation, but we have something like 2 genes predict turnout here. And it happens that pretty much has the findings for cheating or infidelity. These studies, they catch the attention of science journalists, and the newspapers decided to cover this kind of finding, which frustrated many political scientists, because this is geopolitics is controversial in our discipline in many ways, and some people say it's not even political science, it's something different, and it's not really helping us explaining politics. Well, some others say it does. But the point is, it's very rare that a study from the field of the discipline of political science goes out in the news, and now we have this new thing that is geopolitics, and everybody talks about it. And it's a little bit frustrating to some extent. But still, this led me to ask myself the next question. If in the discipline of political science, like in the academic world, people are struggling to make sense of this kind of finding, how is it for the public? How does the public interpret this kind of finding? Or let me frame it just to say that geopolitics has received a lot of media coverage, like pretty much everywhere. In fact, there was a short story in the magazine Playboy too called "Speaking of Geopolitics." But quickly, once in a while, science journalists, they disseminate behavioral genetics research findings suggesting that social orientations and social behaviors are influenced by our genetic predispositions. In some cases, research findings are inconsistent with lay people understanding of human genetics. The question is, how does the public make sense of this information? To repeat, I investigate public understanding of news coverage about behavioral genetics, about political attitudes. So this is like typical framework of a PhD thesis, being very focused on something. But now that I've finished the PhD thesis, I like to think of the more global implications. And I think it has many. So to begin, we need to know what people understand about human genetics. And here there's huge literature on this. And the point here is not to summarize everything. It's impossible. But just to bring some elements to your attention. To begin, there is a literature investigating how people interpret the role of genetics in explaining racial differences. There are a couple of works on that. And in the United States, at least, when we focus on white Americans, the interesting thing is that there is a very clear time trend, a clear pattern, where people in the 70s, they were more likely to believe that the reason why black people have lower socioeconomic status. At this time in the 70s, there were more people saying that it is probably caused by the fact that most black have less inborn ability to learn. Now it's somewhat, it's great to see that the trend is going low, and that nowadays very few people accept this, they agree with this statement. But just to say that there is a literature studying this kind of public understanding of racial genetics. There is also another literature investigating how people understand the basic foundations of human genetics. And in one very interesting paper published in the Journal of Genetic Counseling, some authors, at first citation, they did in-depth telephone interviews with people, asking them various questions about genetics, and their general conclusion is that despite controversial conversational familiarity with genetic terminology, many noted frustration or were hesitant when trying to answer the questions. Yeah, there's another study that is a little bit more optimistic, one published in 2005 in a different journal, Public Understanding of Science. This time the data were from focus groups, and they were more optimistic about the ability of the people to have a critical perspective about genetics at large. Finally, and this is the aspect that I'm more interested with, the question is, what is the public understanding of the influence of genetics on human characteristics? Precisely, what is caused by what? And there is one very interesting research article published by people here at Columbia, actually. And one conclusion from survey data is that, I'll read the quote here again, "Our study identifies high levels of endorsement for genes as causes of health and social outcomes. We describe a cultural schema in which outcomes that are closer to the body are more commonly attributed to genetics." And the same conclusion comes out also from other studies using focus groups. But what does this mean exactly? My literature review, well, the most interesting evidence that I found on this issue comes from a survey that was conducted in the United Kingdom in the beginning of 2000, where the participants, they were simply asked, here's a list of human characteristics. We'd like to ask you, how much do you believe it is caused by genetics, on this scale going from 1 meaning totally environmental and to 5 meaning totally inherited. And then the participants were asked about all of these characteristics, and here the bars, they show the mean genetic attribution. And well, the items, I sorted them so that those with highest genetic attribution are on the left, and those with the lowest are on the right. And one interesting pattern, and this is totally consistent with what I just presented from previous studies, is that those characteristics like eye color, and then, well, we have Huntington disease and sickle cells, but there were a lot of people who didn't know about these items. This is just the mean for those who answered. But then we go with diabetes, intelligence, heart disease, and then we go later with depression, alcoholism, antisocial behavior. So it's really like the closer the body, the higher genetic, the more genetic plays a role. It's just intuitive. It goes with it. Except for things like at the end, flu, which it's what I mean. It's biological, but it's obvious that it's an infectious disease. So this is a little bit the framework I had when I started my own research. Another aspect of the literature is very similar, very close to it. It's just public understanding of information about human genetics. So we go a little bit further. Instead of just asking what they think, we go further and say what they understand when they're presented with new information. And then here again, there's a lot of different aspects of the role of genetics that have been investigated here, but I skipped for reasons of time. Maybe except for this last study that was published recently. Says, can merely learning about obesity genes affect eating behavior? And the funny thing, design is awesome. So they ask participants, they randomize, they ask participants to read a news article saying obesity is partly caused by genetics. And then they ask the participants to stay in a waiting room. And in the waiting room there is a table with a plate with cookies on it. And the dependent variable is the number of cookies people eat. And there is a significant effect. Well, of course it has limited implications, but still interesting. It was published in the journal Appetite.
So it's if they don't think it's genetic, they eat.
If they believe that, well, if they're exposed to the news article about genetic playing a role in explaining eating behavior and obesity, they're more likely to grab the cookies and eat. Yeah, this is the general conclusion. We could replicate. Still, a great number of scholars have expressed concern that significant attention given to genetic research in the media will lead the public to hold deterministic beliefs about the influence of genetics. And surprisingly, there is very little empirical works on this issue. Very little. And when I say empirical, I mean experimental works, where some groups are exposed to some information, some other groups are not. And except there is an interesting paper, though it's a no finding, but here, as Smereknik in 2010, some participants were exposed to a news article or an information suggesting that salt sensitivity, which is a medical problem, could be mostly caused by genetics. And the outcome of the study is that, well, people who are exposed to this information, well, as a kind of persuasion effect, they increase their impression that genetics plays a role into this disease. But they do not tend to generalize the findings to other characteristics. They will not increase their impression that genetics play a role in cancer, for example, or other diseases. So this is a null finding, but quite a significant one in this perspective, at least with regard to this research question. But what about behavioral genetics? Because behavioral genetics is quite different from medical genetics. And this I found nothing, persuasive or in the literature. And that's why I decided to do my PhD on that. So, does exposure to news about behavioral genetics research impacts on people's beliefs about the influence of genetics on human beings? A very large question. First study that I have conducted, it was a survey experiment where I recruited participants to complete the survey online. Like some of you may know, it's possible to do this using crowdsourcing tools like Amazon Mechanical Turk, and that's what I did. I recruited 1,500 participants. I paid them 75 cents to complete the survey. And inside the survey, there was a manipulation. Inside the survey, participants were asked to read a news article, and there was a randomization as to which news article they would be exposed to. In fact, here there were 3 experimental groups. The first group is kind of a control group, and this group was exposed to a news article that was originally published in the Canadian newspaper Toronto Star, and this is our medical genetics stimuli, in fact. K, breast cancer gene discovered, and it goes with how interesting and how it will push medical research into new directions. My impression is that when reading this kind of news, nobody's really surprised. It's just very interesting, but nobody's really surprised about this. Now, it's a little bit different when we go in group 2, where they were exposed to a news article published in Telegraph, a British newspaper. And the title is "Liberal Gene Discovered by Scientists." And this is, again, as you understand, Geopolitics news coverage. And you just see, the idea is that there is a gene that influences novelty-seeking and personality characteristic. And if you have more novelty-seeking, then you're more likely to be liberal than to be conservative. And the studies find significant effect. And at the end of the news article, there is a sentence saying, well, it's significant, but there is a complex interaction with environment. But it's like one sentence at the end, and I suppose most people won't pay very much attention to that, though we could test it, but I didn't. So this is group 2, and group 3 was exposed to a news article that was published in Scientific American in 2010, entitled "Born into Debt, Gene Linked to Credit Card Balances." And this time, the scientists say we find a gene that that is related to risk avoidance. And if you are risk avoidant, then you will be less likely to use your credit card debt because it is a risky behavior. And this gene is significantly associated with lower credit card balance. So as you can, I suppose, imagine, the last 2 news articles are a little bit more surprising than the first one about medical genetics. But these kind of news articles, if you look a little bit on the web, you will see plenty of them published every month in pretty much every country. So I believe the question is relevant here. So what? This is the stimuli, and what is the dependent variable But I was pretty much inspired by the British study I showed you about, where people were asked to estimate the influence of genetics on the battery of items. And I just did the same here. Again, the order of the characteristics were randomized, and I asked the participants, how much do you believe genetics plays a role? And they were asked to answer on a scale going from 0% to 100%. And the bars I will show you will present the mean genetic attribution for each of the items. And these bars are from the control group. And again, we kind of replicate existing knowledge. We have higher genetic attribution for characteristics that are closer to the body, intermediate genetic attribution for personality or talents. Obesity is also there, if I can connect to a previous study I talked about. And then we have lower genetic attribution for those two characteristics that will be the object of the two other groups, which is being liberal or conservative and having credit card debt. And then at the extreme right, there was this item I wanted to introduce as a check, which is preferring Apple or Microsoft. And the truth is that though it is very small, it was statistically significant.
Different from zero.
Different from zero, exactly. But this is also reassuring to see this pattern in a certain way, because it means that the participants, they were attentive. You know, they read the question, they paid attention to what was asked. We asked them to do, and then we have something that is coherent with previous knowledge. Okay, what happens with the first? With the people who are exposed to the news article about political ideology, first of all, their genetic attribution for political ideology increases, doubles in fact, 10 percentage points higher on average, very significant effect, kind of a persuasion effect. But the more interesting pattern is this spillover effect that we observe here. There is also a significant increase, though small, but significant increase in genetic attribution for other things that are not mentioned in the news article. Like this news article is about whether you're conservative or liberal is influenced by genetics, and the fact that I read it will increase my impression that mathematical ability or behaving violently is influenced by genetics. So this was an interesting finding, and the thing is, we have exactly the same result when we compare the control group with the second treatment group. Again, this is the control group, and then participants who were exposed to the news article about credit card debt, they increase in an even larger effect this time, their genetic attribution for this characteristic, and then we have this, again, this kind of spillover effect. I'll talk a little bit later about possible explanation for that, but now I just introduced this finding. And the purpose of this study was not to investigate what is the exact psychological mechanism behind this, so there would need to be more research about this. But I think the finding is interesting, and it was recently published in scientific journal Bioscience. So this leads us to a second research question. And as this was a thesis in political science, I had to focus my attention on politics here. The question is, could geopolitics increase genetic determinism? Which is a broader question. It's not just about genetic attribution, it's a bit broader. But what do we mean exactly by genetic determinism? And unfortunately, I must say, I was not very satisfied with what I have found in the literature, because there are a lot of people speaking about this without to give a definitive definition or using somewhat vague terms. So it's a little bit difficult to operationalize what is genetic determinism. But if we stick to the words determinism, it would suggest that it is, of course, someone who believes that genetics explain everything. And if we investigate genetic determinism, should we focus our attention only on those people who believe genetics explain everything? Well, if we do, we will probably focus our attention on very few people, because nobody thinks that. However, if we take a more let's say, a broader interpretation of this concept, we can study whether a treatment, a news article, like I do, moves people's belief in this direction. Instead of just studying the extreme of this scale, we can study the direction, the effect direction. Here, if we look at the American Psychological Association's Dictionary of Psychology, we get the following definition. The doctrine that human and non-human animal behavior and mental activity are largely or completely controlled by the genetic constitution of the individual, and that responses to environmental influences are, for the most part, innately determined. Now, this last aspect of the definition brings another level of complexity. It says, even if there is some interaction with the environment, if we control for environment, then genetics determines everything. I'm not sure if I agree with this whole definition, but it's more to introduce you to the concept here. But how do we measure genetic determinism? Professor Phelan, she did in a paper she published in 2005. In fact, the scale was called Genetic Essentialism. And but the problem with this, with the scale she used, is that it was framed to be used with a vignette experiment. And this is clearly not the case here. We have a stimuli, a treatment, a news article, and we cannot say whether, the question is not whether the person presented in the vignette was influenced or not by her genetics, for instance. So it doesn't fit, although this is a very interesting scale, it doesn't really fit with our study here. Instead, I used a different scale that was developed in 2005 by Keller, Professor Johann Keller, with an interesting title also, In Genes We Trust. And this time we have a scale with 18 items investigating different aspects, such as what are the causes of familial similarities, the causes of group differences, also, again, the influence of genetics on personality as well as intelligence and sexual orientation. But also something like the participants, they were asked to report how much they believe it is possible to predict someone's characteristics, knowing his or her genetic background. So it's a more complete scale. It's not like what I used in the previous study. It's more complex, but it's, I think it was fit for what I wanted to measure. It corresponds to genetic determinism. And this scale was replicated also on the original study was on German students, and it was also used on Italian sample, and it was also very reliable in terms of scale validity. This time, again, I recruited participants from the web. Again, I paid them a little bit so that they answer my survey. Again, they're asked to read a news article. This time, the news article is different. What I do, okay, I'll go step by step. Here we have a control group that is exposed to a news article that has nothing to do with genetics. It's a news article saying, it's an interview with Mark Zuckerberg, saying we've reached the 1 billionth Facebook experiment, Facebook user. The point is, we wanted participants to read something, and this is the control group. It has nothing to do with genetics. This is a comparison group. And then we have a news article that was originally published in a magazine of a university, and we framed it as if it was to be published in the New York Times to give it some credibility. So this news article was an interview with a researcher in Geopolitics, and in the interview, the interviewer asks questions about what it is, geopolitics. We'll go through the news article in a minute. So this is the original version. And then what we do is we manipulate the answer of the professor. In a different group, there are, the interviewer still asks the same question, but the answers are different. And we want to see if this makes any difference. And the manipulation, as I will explain in a second, the first manipulation was to include a high heritability estimate. like genetics explain a lot according to twin studies. And we wanted to see how people react to this information. And the second manipulation is to include insights about population genetics differences. So let's skip over the Facebook news article, but let's go to the original news article just to give you an idea of what participants they were asked to do. So they were asked to read this news article with an introducing paragraph presenting the professor, and then the interviewer says, first, what is genopolitics? And then the professor answers, genopolitics takes seriously the possibility that some of the differences we see among individuals, such as their propensity to participate in politics, or how they respond to different types of policies, may be due to genetic variations. The interviewer pursues, voting in elections is a modern phenomenon. Are you saying humans have genes that regulate their political views or inclination to vote? The answer is no. There is no single gene that decides if you are conservative or liberal. But if I told you that people who dislike conflict are less likely to vote, and that conflict avoidance has some degree of heritability, then I don't think it's too great leap to say that the same genes that regulate conflict avoidance also partially regulate engagement in politics. Here is an interesting sentence. Genes are rarely deterministic. They influence the tendency towards certain behaviors, but we are still social creatures who are affected by our environments. I'll just continue with the most important aspects of this news article. There is just a general description of the study that the author participated in. I'll skip over this paragraph and I'll go with the next one. Could geopolitics be used to explain why India has a democratic system and China does not? Here the answer is absolutely not. Your question reflects a common line of thinking that it's incorrect. We are not looking for differences between big groups of people. We are looking for differences within groups of people. It would not be correct for us to make arguments about differences between large populations. So here we have a professor giving a very cautious answer to this interesting question. This is the original version. The first manipulation we do in the other treatment group is that we change two sentences. Let's go back for a second. So at the end of the second paragraph here, professor, just to recall, says, genes are rarely deterministic. They influence the tendency towards certain behaviors, but we are still social creatures who are affected by our environment. And now in this manipulation, the professor says, genes are rarely deterministic, but their overall influence is important. Data on identical and fraternal twins indicate that genetics explain between 50 and 70% of the differences in voter behavior. So we tested how people interpret this. Now we have this other treatment group with another manipulation. This time, the professor is less cautious about the question regarding population genetics. So could geopolitics be used to explain why India has a democratic system and China does not? It probably does. Now that the necessary technology is available, geneticists are beginning to investigate whether genes vary enough between populations to influence group outcomes. Preliminary results suggest that the development of democracy in a given part of the world partly depends on the population's genetic makeup. Now, there was a debriefing, okay, at the end of the study. People were reminded what they read, and then they were exposed to what was in the original version of the interview. And of course, the author of this interview, the professor at University of Toronto, he knew that we were manipulating the content of his interview. He was also very curious to see how people interpret his research. He was concerned about it, in fact. So,
Did the New York Times know that you were attributing?
No, they were not. Maybe they should. I don't know if it's complicated to do that.
Sure.
Yeah. So maybe we should not do this again. But just to say that this was also part of the briefing, that it was not originally from the New York
Oh,
Times.
okay.
Okay?
I got you off the hook.
At the end, yeah.
Yeah.
Hopefully. So what are the results? Just to help you read this chart, so we have the different symbols, legend at the top, where the X refers to the control group, and then we have the original version of the article, the heritability version, and then the population genetics version, which is a square. And the Y-axis is the mean response on the scales that were going from 0 to 7. 0 meaning genetics plays very little or no role, and 7 meaning genetics plays an important role. And what we can see is that we observe significant differences here. At the left part of the chart shows the responses for one item where participants were asked their beliefs about the influence of genetics on intelligence. And although there is no significant difference between the control group and the original version, as you saw, it was kind of a cautious version. There is a significant difference between the control group and two other versions, like the one with heritability estimates and the one with population genetics. The same conclusion holds for another question that asked generally to the participants how much they believe genetics explains behaviors, human behaviors. Except, as you see, although the difference between the control group and the original version is not significant, it is very close from being. But again, if we jump to the heritability version and the population genetics version, then we have significant differences compared to the control group. But finally, the last part of the chart presents the mean response on the 11 item that was the core of the genetic belief in genetic attribution scale. Again, here we had a very strong reliability with alpha of 0.84, I think, 0.83. And because we have narrower confidence intervals, but here again we have significant differences between the control group and the heritability version as well as the population genetics version. And again, we see a small effect for the original news article, but this one does not reach statistical significance. I'd like to exchange with you about these results, so I will not take too much time interpreting it, but I'd like to exchange with you so that I can have your views or your feedbacks. But if I can summarize this presentation with two take-home points, one from each of my studies. The first one is that exposure to news about behavioral genetics can contribute at increasing the perceived influence of genetics on characteristics that are not even mentioned in the news article. This is the main problem I identified. This is the take-home point. The second is that people are sensible to the different aspects of the news content, such as the type of research findings presented to support the argument that genetics plays a role, whether it's twin study, whether it's population genetics, or whether it's a bit more vague as it was in the original version of the news article. Here is very shortly a possible explanation for what we've seen today, what I call in my thesis the genetic interpolation effect. You might call it differently. But the basic idea is that when reading a news article about behavioral genetics, people, they think to themselves, and this is the bubble with people at bottom right, they think to themselves, if scientists, which are a reliable source of information, they're experts, if scientists are persuaded that genetics is strong enough to influence credit card debt, golfing behavior, or we can go with cheating on your girlfriend or boyfriend, then it means that the influence of genetics on human beings is stronger than I thought at first. So the idea behind this very simple mechanism is that the people are exposed to novel information. And this novel information, because it comes from a source that they have some trust in, they tend to accept it, but they also tend to think about the consequences, this is true, then other things, it has implications. So this is a possible explanation. I'm not saying it is. I'll have to do more research on that. Finally, to finish this presentation, a couple of questions have come out of my research. First of all, would we find the same effect outside the United States? Two samples I used are from the United States. Maybe there's something that makes genetic a special argument in the US that is not elsewhere. I don't know. It's worth checking. Also, very simple question, but I need to come back on this. Would news about medical genetics have the same effect? We know from the literature, from one paper, Smereknik in 2010, there seems to be no such generalization effect when people are exposed to medical genetics. But this is just one paper. I think it would be worth trying to replicate and see if we find the same result, the same conclusion. And this is a limitation of some of the presentation of the works I've shown you today. And the next work I will do will try to cope with this limitation. Also, is the effect stronger when people are exposed to several news articles about behavioral genetics? So say there is a magazine that is Scientific American presenting a special issue about behavioral genetics. Would the effect of reading the whole magazine be the same as simply reading one news article? This is a question worth asking. Or students having a class on behavioral genetics. Maybe this will increase their genetic attribution or change their beliefs. Probably it will. And finally, and this is probably the most important question, does the effect persist in time? Like if we find this somewhat disconcerting finding that I showed you today, that people, they tend to generalize the influence of genetics from a single message, well, it's a problem if it remains, if the impact stays after 3 weeks, 1 month, 2 months. But if 10 minutes or 15 minutes after news exposure, the people, they think to something else and they just don't remember about this, then maybe it's not such a big problem. Or maybe third point and the fourth point, they interact. Maybe you will remember it more if you're exposed to many news articles instead of only one. So this is also something that I will test in one of my future research that will go on this summer. Thank you.
Okay, so we have some time for questions. Alexandre, why don't you call on?
I will do that. Hi.
Hi. Thank you for really compelling talk. I think it's such an interesting topic. And I know you have both of you really powerful sample sizes when you use the social media, the
Amazon mechanical turk.
Yeah. Were you able to correlate any demographic variables with some of these dependent variables? In other words, were you able to tap into the respondents' level of education or their age to see if that also played a role in it?
Yeah, so of course the question is, are some people more affected by the news? And despite our large sample size, although there were some patterns suggesting that people with more education achievement attainment, they are less affected, the moderation effect was not statistically significant. And we can go further than that, because in the first study that I've presented to you with all the bars that were going up and showing the effects on the various items, I had included a battery of items measuring people's scientific literacy. So some of the items were asking for knowledge questions. Some others were statistical tests, like what is the best answer?
Numeracy.
Numeracy, exactly. And unfortunately, maybe not. I don't know what are the implications, but there were no statistically significant moderation effect. And this I was very surprised.
Did you have variability in numeracy and literacy?
There was, but not as much as there would be in a nationally representative sample. Like, this is one trick. With using crowdsourcing, Amazon mechanical turk, people are more educated than the general public. So that's why I like to use it to test like direct effects. But when it comes to testing whether some subgroups are more affected by it than others, it's a little bit more tricky because of this. But there was diversity in age and income. There was some diversity. So even with this limitation I just told you, I'm surprised that there is no significant moderation.
Thank you.
We'll see.
So I wonder if you have thoughts about why, assuming that the study that showed no generalization from medical genetic information is correct,
Mm-hmm.
why that might be in contrast to the effect that you're finding. If I'm reminded of the influence of genetics on a variety of health-related or bodily-related characteristics, why doesn't that generalize?
Yeah, I don't have a firm answer to this. As you said in the first place, I'm very cautious about whatever arguments I make. But my intuition is that, and you pretty much said it a few seconds ago, it's a reminder. It's something that people already know. Or any information that says some disease or some biological characteristics that we have are influenced by genetics, I think it is already consistent with people's understanding of human genetics. As I've showed in previous slides, you know, it is consistent, and any additional information would be seen as a confirmation. You know, this is something I already know, but yeah, this is new research. It's very interesting. If we finally understand how genetics impacts on cancer, what is the exact gene and stuff like that, it's very interesting. But I was expecting this. You know, everybody talks about this. So this would be my first guess is that the role of cognitive dissonance is important. The idea that when you're exposed to behavioral genetics, you're exposed to information that goes somewhat against what you already know, and how you already understand the influence of genetics. So that would be the short answer. But I will test.
I had this sort of similar thought, and that is, you know, we're being flooded with information from about precision medicine, which, you know, is the idea that everything is really genetic, that we're going to cure all of the diseases that are, you know, affecting mankind by sequencing genomes. I think that's really very much what the message is now. And so I'm wondering what impact that will have on people, you know, hearing about that in the news and all.
I think, unfortunately, I did pretty much that. This aspect of the literature I've covered it pretty much. There is very little in terms of. Well, there is a huge literature on stigma, as you know very well, on other aspects of sociology, of discrimination. But the basic, maybe we go back to the basics here. People understanding of genetics, there are very few studies testing how people react to information. There are some in the literature on genetic counseling, but it is more often like direct one-to-one interview, and then it's not the same study design, you know. And I admittedly haven't been through all this literature that shows somewhat converging, but also some other findings that go in the opposite direction. So it's hard to know exactly what to take home from this.
There's a related literature on how people come to believe what caused their illness. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I've been trying to understand the relationship between that and genetic attribution and what the possible impact of genetic attribution is on people's own experience of their illness. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to find that literature, but it would be interesting to use some of these approaches that you're talking about to try to get at that.
I think that's very cheap to do. No, yeah. That's very cheap to do. It costs $1,000 to do an experiment with 1,050 people, 500 people. That's cheap. We can test that. It takes some time to do the design and to make sure that you think about all the different angles. But you have a sample that is definitely more heterogeneous than anything you can get from student samples, and that is definitely cheaper than anything you would want to have with a nationally representative sample. And if what you care about is internal validity, about how people react, and then you want to check if what the differences you see are caused by messages, I think it's possible. It's possible to do that with pretty much every messages, and some of the gaps that you highlight in the literature, we could fill these like in a couple of months.
Great.
I don't know these gaps, so you'd have to do the literature review.
So just to respond a little bit to that, we're some genetic counselors from clinical genetics over here, and I'm actually part of a new program that we're doing whole exome sequencing for undiagnosed conditions. But when I think about that, what's interesting to me and how I differentiate it in my mind is that genetic testing that is giving you something that's correlative and genetic testing that's giving you something that's causative or deterministic. And so there's different types of genetic test results, and interpreting those is very important, but I think that there is a very distinct difference. So for instance, 23andMe is an organization out there that has direct-to-consumer testing, and they have a lot of correlative results. So for instance, something that may increase your risk for diabetes, may increase your risk for heart disease, but it's not causative. And a lot of times in clinical genetics, a lot of the testing we do is causative. It is deterministic. It's, you have this gene, it is known, and these are your associated risks. But as we learn more about genetics, we learn more about the complexities and the modifications. So it's going to be balancing that and educating appropriately about what's actually directly causing something and what is just a possible prediction of what may come. But that's
a level of refinement you never get in a news article, you know?
Exactly. And that was one of the issues with 23andMe was the science of that you can't, how do you control how someone interprets that, right? And you can't.
I think yes.
That's, well, I mean, that brings me to that's really the point. Like, who's the messenger? I mean, I was fascinating how you changed, I think it was the Canadian Press to the New York Times, the paper of record, and I think that's a really cool idea, is to moderate the print media. And also I think about people who get their information about genetics outside of the print media, just, on some, these hideous things on the internet and elsewhere that we know are we like to think are less reliable than what's in print. They're not all reading journals, genetics journals, or talking to a genetics counselor. And I think that's a really interesting aspect of your research, in that you're moderating the source of the information.
That would be easily testable. And in fact, in the original design of one of the studies I showed you, there was a news article suggesting eugenics causes political ideology. But this news appeared on the website of Fox News.
Here we go.
I didn't want to say Fox News.
And the title was "Scientists Find the Genes More Liberal. They're Now Trying to Find the Cure." Good, you get it. It's not something you would trust as a source of science.
This was great. It's a wonderful presentation and really fascinating just how you manipulate the variables and show the effects of different forms of information about similar topics. I was curious if you have any thoughts, or if you know of any literature that looks at similar designs related to other causal or correlated factors, say environmental causation, and whether there's an interesting question there to be asked about whether genetics has some either culturally inherent or inherent on its own terms value to people that makes it influence all of the direct effects more so than, say, like an article about environmental causation would. So to compare different forms of causal narratives that come out of the media, and to see whether genetics has more of an effect on overall perceptions than, say, another type of causal narrative.
Yeah. There's again, this is a very interesting question. I think I will introduce some aspects of this in my future research, there's no doubt. There's an article that was published in Science in 2006, and they were asking women to have math tests. And before doing the math tests, they were exposing participants